Our first keynote speaker is Simine Vazire. She is a professor at Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And her research examines the individual and institutional practices and norms in science, as well as the degree to which these norms encourage or impede self-correction and credibility in science. Furthermore, she's an editor-in-chief of the great Collab Psychology, which is a great gold or fully open access journal, and she has served as an editor at several other journals as well. She is a board member of the Public Library of Science, better known as PLOS, and a board member of the Berkeley Institute for Transparency in the Social Sciences, which we know as BITS with double S. In the United States, she was also a member of the National Academy of Science Study Committee that studied replicability and reproducibility. They identified the issues for the National Academy. And last but not least, she co-founded the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science, which we know as SIPS. Dear Professor Vazire, thank you so much for being here. We are truly honored to have you here. Also, even more, I think, because it's now almost midnight in Australia. You're attending from Australia. So I guess you are sacrificing your evening to be with us. We are very excited to hear you talk. And without further ado, I would like to give you the floor.
So we're here to talk about open science and transparency. And I think that it's really important to remember that open science, being open and transparent, is really good for its own sake. But I also wanted to kind of challenge us to think about what else transparency is good for besides for its own sake. And in thinking about this, I spent a lot of time thinking about what makes science a distinctive way of knowing, what is special about science. I teach undergraduate research methods, so this is a question that comes up a lot. And I used to give kind of the textbook answer of like science is self-correcting, there's scientific methods that are special and make things more scientific and all that. But as I started to think more about, how do I know these things? Why am I repeating these things? It was harder and harder for me to explain what it is about science that makes it distinct from other ways of knowing and that makes it, to my mind, special. And this is actually reflected in public opinion polls. So if you look at public opinion polls about trust in science, public trust in science in many countries is quite high. And even in the US, it's consistently high, even in recent years, as high as it is for just about any other institution. But in those same polls, when you ask the public, do you think that scientists, for example, admit and take responsibility for their mistakes or are transparent about conflicts of interest? The same respondents who have a lot of trust in science in general still say that actually don't think that scientists admit and take responsibility for their mistakes. Only about 12 to 13% of respondents agree with the statement that scientists admit and take responsibility for mistakes, which to me shows a pretty high degree of sophistication. The public is not naive about scientists. They understand that we're human. Humans tend not to be very good at admitting and taking responsibility for mistakes, and neither are scientists. But this does raise this conundrum of isn't the whole thing about science supposed to be about self-correction? That's what makes it distinct. So how do the public resolve this inconsistency that they trust science, but they don't trust individual scientists to self-correct? And the answer to this is probably no mystery to people who study, for example, the sociology of science or the history and philosophy of science. And the idea is that the trustworthiness of science doesn't come from individuals being trustworthy. It comes from a process that's a social process. And there's a quote from Don Campbell, who was himself a psychologist, but also a very strong methodologist and thought a lot about these kinds of issues, where he said that the dependability of scientific reports comes from a social process rather than from dependence on honesty and competence of any single experimenter. And he goes on to say, organized distrust produces trustworthy reports. You might recognize the phrase organized distrust is similar to Robert Merton, a sociologist of science, who talked about organized skepticism as one of the core values of science. And this is maybe getting a little bit closer to what makes science trustworthy than just saying, oh, science is self-correcting. But it still kind of raises more questions about what does that organized distrust look like? In practice, what are the concrete ways that we know that scientists value this organized skepticism, organized distrust, the social process, self-correction? And what I'm going to argue today is that there's two parts to what makes science trustworthy or credible or self-correcting. And half of that, one pillar, is transparency, but it's only one half. So transparency is obviously very important to self-correction. If we're not transparent, then there's no chance of people finding our errors, or it's much slower for people to find our errors and correct them. So transparency includes a lot of different things, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about some concrete signs of how we're doing on transparency. But transparency alone isn't enough. So it's true that transparency is a necessary criterion for credibility, for self-correction, etc. If we are transparent, we can help find each other's errors, we can correct them, we can try to avoid making those same errors in the future. And if we do that, then we increase in credibility. But that's not the only way it can go. There's another world where we increase in transparency, but we lose credibility. And that's the world where, after we're transparent, it becomes obvious that we have lots and lots of errors, that they're really errors that we should be able to avoid, unforced errors, and that we don't learn from our mistakes. We keep making the same errors over and over again. And in that case, we lose credibility, and we lose credibility. So I think it would be naive to say that transparency guarantees credibility. Transparency doesn't guarantee credibility. Transparency guarantees that we get the credibility we deserve. And what's the difference? So if we're going to encourage people to be transparent, how do they protect themselves as a community against losing credibility? Well, the difference is how strong our methods are. Or do we raise the bar on quality? If not, then the transparency is going to show that. There's a quote here from Andrew Gelman. He has a very nice, very short paper called "Honest Transparency or Not Enough," where he makes this case. And he says, consider the practical consequences for a researcher who eagerly accepts the message of ethical and practical values of sharing and openness, but does not learn about the importance of data quality. They could then just be driving very carefully and very efficiently into a brick wall, conducting transparent experiment after transparent experiment, and continuing to produce and publish noise. So that world is still better than a world where it's not transparent, where we're producing and publishing noise in a non-transparent way. So absolutely, transparency is better than a lack of transparency. It's important, if we want to enhance our credibility, our trustworthiness, that we combine transparency with rigorous methods. And in order to claim that we really prioritize self-correction, then we need the second pillar of credibility, which is what I call critical appraisal or quality control. What this is people going in and using that transparency in order to find ways to improve our research, find errors, find things that could be better, pointing them out, working together to enhance and improve our methods. So in this idea where there's transparency and there's critical appraisal, I like to use the analogy of a car. And in this case, transparency means lifting the hood and making it possible for people to come in and look at the insides of the car. Without transparency, it's hopeless, right? It's going to be hard, and it should be hard, to convince people to buy your product, to believe your claims, because you're not even willing to let them look under the hood. So transparency is absolutely critical for credibility. But just because the hood is lifted doesn't mean the car is in good shape, right? What we need for people to go in there and dig into the car's engine and so on, and see if it's solid, and see where there are weaknesses and where it needs to be fixed or strengthened. So that's where critical appraisal comes in. So what I've been working on with some collaborators in the last probably few years is trying to come up with some very specific ways that we could operationalize what it looks like for a research community to really value transparency and critical appraisal, so that when we go around and say, you should trust science, or you should trust our science in particular, we can point to specific things. Or when a scientific field or community has problems, we can say, well, what was different about that community than the others, so that we don't erroneously spread all of the crisis of credibility across all sciences. So what are some of the concrete signs of a commitment to self-correction? So let's start with transparency. What are some concrete signs of transparency? Oh, great, there are my slides. So let me see if I don't know if I'm advancing them or somebody else is, but okay, so here we go. So pre-registration is one. And with this crowd, I probably don't need to go into much detail about what pre-registration is. But here's some evidence about how we're doing on pre-registration. And actually, this isn't just from psychology. This is all pre-registration on the Open Science Framework. And of course, there are other places to pre-register. And this goes up to 2018. So now it would look even more, it would be even higher numbers. And so the left axis and the black line are the number of pre-registrations on the Open Science Framework over time. And there's quite a few pre-registrations, and a lot of these are coming from psychology, but there's other fields joining in too. And then the right axis and the blue bars, green bars, are registered reports, the number of journals offering registered reports, and we'll come back to that in a second. But it's a extreme pre-registration where you actually submit the work for peer review before you collect the data. So you basically write your intro and methods and your pre-registration for what you'll do, and then that gets peer reviewed. If it gets accepted in principle, then authors agree to follow the plan, the journal agrees to publish regardless of the result. So it's a very strong form of pre-registration. Other signs of commitment to transparency are the frequency with which researchers share their data and code when that's ethically and legally possible. And again, here we've made quite a bit of progress. So you might have heard about the study by Jelte Wickerts and colleagues that came out before the replication crisis, actually. This was a study they conducted in 2005 where they were trying to, my dishwasher wants me to know that it's done, so that's the beeping in the background. They were trying to collect data from published papers to test a different research question. They wanted to reanalyze the data and test a substantive research question. But so they decided to contact authors of papers published in journals that require authors to share their data upon request. And actually, the research project became just about how hard it was to do that. So this was published in 2006, and they reported the proportion of authors that shared their data upon request. So 11% shared their data upon first request, another 16% after some reminders, 35% refused to or were unable to share the data, 4% had undeliverable emails, 14% never replied, and then another 20% promised the data but never delivered. So that's still, there's some evidence that it's still the case that when data are supposedly available upon request, it's actually not that easy to get the data. But luckily, there's a different and better solution, which is just to make data sharing the default at the same time as publication, again, when that's possible. And here we have pretty good evidence that that's on the rise, and I'll show you some evidence about that in the next slide, along with data on open materials. Open materials is sharing the instruments, details about the procedure, the steps, details of the steps someone would need in order to conduct a replication study, for example. So there was a way of social scientists of different fields that just asked scientists to self-report whether they've used any of these registration, open data, open materials, and if so, to retrospect when was the first year that they used this practice. So this graph shows the proportion of researchers surveyed, which was about 600 researchers across the social sciences, and when they reported first using that practice. So the black line is the proportion who've used any practice at all, and by the last year of the survey, 2017, it was about 80%. And most of those are people who have posted their data. That's the green line. The pink line is people who have posted their study instruments or their materials. And the bottom line, the orange one, is people who have pre-registered. So we can get some of which practices are more common, but open data is becoming much more common in the social sciences, at least. So those are good signs of transparency. Another kind of transparency, as was mentioned in the opening comments, is open access or preprints. And here again, there's some data showing that the use of preprint servers is on the rise. So these data are now a year old or a little bit more than a year old. And these are a variety of different preprint servers across different sciences. And you can see that the use of these preprint servers is on the rise. And for SciArchive specifically, I also pulled some more recent numbers that I found on Twitter. SciArchive now receives about 450 submissions a month and has about 335,000 downloads each month. So this kind of openness and transparency is also doing well. Some kinds of openness that I think we still need to do a lot of work on that are maybe a little bit slower to pick up. One is open review, which is journals publishing the content of peer review, the decision letter and the reviews, along with the papers that they publish. A more radical version would be to do the review openly from the beginning. So at the time that it's happening, it's open. So for example, meta-psychology does this, or posting the reviews regardless of whether the paper is accepted or not. So we're starting to see journals take steps in this direction, but it's still relatively rare. And I think this is a really important aspect of openness. We need to remember that openness and transparency are not just for individual researchers, but also for gatekeepers and institutions. We need transparency on the part of journals so that we can evaluate and hold them accountable for how good their peer review process is. Another kind of transparency that I think we need to improve on, is declaring conflicts of interest. So this varies across fields, but at least in my field of psychology, still quite rare. And we're not very creative in thinking about different kinds of potential conflicts of interest. Another one that has been getting some attention, but I think need to get more uptake, is the idea of moving away from an authorship model of assigning credit to a contributorship model, where people get credit specifically for what they contributed to a paper. And this makes it both more transparent on the part so that readers know who did what and can hold the right people accountable and so on, but also so that authors or contributors get the credit for exactly what they did and get recognized for their contribution. It also means that more people can get recognized if the criterion is not authorship, which has a heavy emphasis on writing. So those are some indicators of a commitment to transparency, and we can ask how are different fields or scientific communities doing? And this is, of course, a partial list. There are probably many, many more ways that we could be committed to transparency. And I would love to expand this list and keep working. And of course, some of the things on this list are not appropriate in some cases. There are some kinds of research where maybe open data is not possible or pre-registration is not possible. So we need to keep developing these indicators of a commitment to transparency so that they can be more diverse and applicable to a lot of different sciences, and we can hold scientific communities accountable for the kinds of transparency that apply to them. But I also want to save some time to talk about critical appraisal, which I think gets less attention, but is just as important. So being transparent is really important, but then we also have to ask, does the scientific community actually value and reward going into that transparent material and looking under the hood and digging around and seeing what's there? So I'm going to talk about a few different ways that a scientific community could show its commitment to critical appraisal. The first is, I forgot one really important aspect of transparency, which is no barriers to entry. So if we really are committed to transparency and openness, it means that we can't have a hierarchy in terms of whose claims are more likely to be believed or valued. We need to evaluate everyone the same way, make it a level playing field open to anyone who wants to participate. Okay, so moving on to critical appraisal, the first indicator of a commitment to critical appraisal is strong theory. And this might be intuitive, but strong theory is an important part of holding ourselves accountable and making our predictions falsifiable and knowing when we're accumulating knowledge and knowing when we're going down the wrong path and need to turn around. So a scientific community that works towards clear quantitative predictions is one that's more committed to correction and admitting mistakes than one that leaves their theories vague and ambiguous. This is because, as is captured in this quote by Andrew Gilman, there's a problem when theories are too flexible. So he says theories are so flexible, and he's talking about the social sciences here, that just about any comparison can be taken to be consistent with theory. Remember sociologist Jeremy Fries's characterization of some hypotheses as, quote, more vampirical than empirical, unable to be killed by mere evidence. So this impedes error detection and self-correction when we can't clearly tell whether a result is consistent with a theoretical prediction or not. Other kinds of error detection are much more simple and straightforward, just literally looking for inconsistencies in papers. And being in the Netherlands, you've probably heard of the tool developed by some of your colleagues at Tilburg University, StatCheck, which just scrapes articles from scrape statistics reported in APA style from articles and identifies any inconsistencies. So an inconsistency is when, for example, the test statistic and degrees of freedom doesn't match up with the p-values. And what they call a gross inconsistency is when the p-value is reported as statistically significant, but the test statistic and degrees of freedom suggests that it should not be, or vice versa. And so what they found is in this sample of psychology articles, half of them had a StatCheck inconsistency. Now, some of these are probably false positives, and 1 in 8 had a gross inconsistency. So these kinds of errors are now really easy to detect and hopefully really easy to fix. We can just run all papers through StatCheck before publishing them. Other kinds of errors, however, are not so easy to detect or fix. And these could be things like errors in the design of the study or conceptual errors, maybe operationalizations or interpretation of the results. And for these, we need to be a little bit more creative in how we try to prioritize detecting and correcting those errors. And we've seen some really exciting developments recently. So for example, one is the idea of red teaming your work. And Nicholas Coles is an example of this. He actually paid other researchers to try to find errors in his work. So this is an extreme example of prioritizing critical appraisal, detecting errors, and correcting them. Now, this is maybe hard to scale up and not possible for everyone to do, but luckily there's a mechanism that provides your very own red team for your research at a time when you can still do something about it. So before it's too late, before you've collected your data, and that's the mechanism I mentioned before, registered reports. So in registered reports, you submit your work for peer review before you collect the data, after you've outlined rationale, research questions, the methods, your proposed analyses. So you get your very own red team. You get an editor, and if they send it out to review, you get reviewers to weigh in and pick apart your design, your rationale, your methods, etc., give you feedback at a time when you can still use it to improve the design of the study and change the methods and so on. And so this is a really useful way to detect and fix some of these more conceptual errors, not just things like stat check and so on. Another really fundamental aspect of a scientific community that values critical appraisal and error detection is diversity. And this is because we're all going to have different blind spots and different things that we miss in our research and in evaluating others' research. So if we all come from the same background, have the same past experiences, the same biases and assumptions, we're going to miss the same things, and our blind spots are going to be compounded. But it's only by having different backgrounds, different experiences, different assumptions and biases that we can catch each other's biases and errors. And this is articulated really well in a quote from Naomi Oreskes' book, where she's actually describing Helen Longino's ideas about this. And she says, the greater the diversity and openness of a community and the stronger its protocols for supporting free and open debate, the greater the degree of objectivity it may be able to achieve, as individual biases and background assumptions are outed by the community. If you think about registered reports or think about assembling a red team, it becomes really obvious that of course you wouldn't want a homogeneous group of reviewers, right? You would try to select people with different areas of expertise, different backgrounds, different experiences, different biases, so that they could catch a lot of different kinds of errors. It would be a waste to have a community that was all homogeneous and all had the same blind spots. Some other ways to assess errors and try to find problems in our scientific work. One is to check for reproducibility, so just to look whether we can reproduce the same results with the same data. So this is not collecting new data, but just reusing the same data as the original study and checking to see if we can obtain the same results. And this is often hard to do because the data are not always available. But Tom Hardwick and his colleagues took advantage of a set of studies where they knew the data would be available because the journal had just changed their policy to require open data upon publication whenever ethically possible. And this was the journal Cognition. So Tom Hardwick and his colleagues selected a number of papers from the journal Cognition, got the data, and tried to reproduce all of the results in those papers. What they found was that this was a lot of work. It was not at all straightforward to do. And they were only able to reproduce all of the results in the papers independently for 11 out of the 35 papers that they attempted to reproduce. That's about a third. For another third or so, they were able to reproduce all the results, but only after getting assistance from the original authors. And for the last 13, a little bit more than a third, they were not able to fully reproduce everything in the paper despite author assistance. So this is just a small sample, and it's also not a representative sample. This is a sample of papers where the authors knew that they would have to share their data because they were submitting to a journal with a mandatory data sharing policy. So likely they put more care into making sure that their results were reproducible, that their data was easy to analyze. So this suggests that, at least for this field, there's a lot of room to work on reproducibility. But the fact that these kinds of meta-scientific projects are happening is a good sign for the field's commitment to detecting and correcting errors and improving itself. Another kind of activity that a healthy field that cares about self-correction does is replications. And assessing the level of replicability in the field and asking, is this as high as we want it to be? Do we have any problems, and so on? And by now, you've all heard the results of the replication studies in social science, but here's a summary of many of the large-scale replication projects across the social sciences, mostly psychology. And out of these 199 studies, and I picked ones where they had relatively high standards, either very large samples or with some exceptions, and I think these were pre-registered and committed to publishing the result regardless of the outcome, and only about a 50% success rate in these studies. Of course, again, this is not a representative sample of studies, and we could talk about whether this is an estimate or an overestimate. Even if we don't generalize beyond this sample, for these 199 studies, it's a pretty disappointing success rate. And even if, of course, we should take that point estimate with a big confidence interval, but even 60%, I think, for me, would be disappointing, given that these were studies that were published in very, very selective journals for the most part, that have had relatively high impact, that hopefully should have been scrutinized before getting published in these outlets and getting cited so much. But the fact that these projects are happening, again, is a good sign. And the more replications are happening, the more trust we should have that a field really is committed to self-correction. Another sign that a field cares about getting it right is how much they publish negative or null results. So here, if the literature is almost entirely positive results, that should be the red flag. And that is the case, unfortunately, for my field of psychology. Unfortunately, because the animation is messed up, you can't see this, but actually that green bar at the bottom that says psychology is over 90%. That's the proportion of significant results in psychology and psychiatry. So over 90% of results in that field are significant. And that's unfortunate. It's as bad in many other fields, but psychology just happens to be a little bit more extreme than some of the others. It's not uncommon for scientific fields to be almost exclusively contain significant findings in the published work. Now, this is an area where registered reports are supposed to help, right? Because the authors commit to following the plan and the journals commit to publish results regardless of what happens. So that removes opportunities for bias both on the part of the authors and on the part of the journals or editors. So there's been some research looking at, is it the case that registered reports actually have more null results in them? And Anna Schiel and some of her colleagues have done this specifically within psychology. There's another project that looks at registered reports more broadly. And in both cases, they find similar results, which I don't think are going to show up. Yeah. But what they find is, so in the standard reports, it's again, 95% of psychology papers claim to have discovered a significant result. In the registered reports literature, it's 45%. So when there's no protection against flexibility on the part of the authors and bias on the part of the journals, only 5% of the literature is null results. But when those opportunities for flexibility and bias are removed, or at least reduced a lot, and 5% of the published results are null or not significant. Now, there are several possible explanations for this. Maybe the kinds of questions that get asked in registered reports are different than the kinds of questions that get asked in standard reports. I personally don't think that's likely to be the explanation. I think it has a lot more to do with the biases that come in standard reports and how they affect the results that get reported. It's also striking that the proportion of significant results in registered reports, 45%, is very similar to the proportion of successful replications among the high-quality replication attempts, which is 46%. I think that might be a coincidence, but both of them point to a similar conclusion, which is that a lot of the significant results in the traditional literature might disappear if we instituted safeguards to protect from these biases. Another really important hallmark of a community that's committed to self-correction and to critical appraisal is the healthiness and robustness of post-publication peer review. And again, this is something where it's starting to see progress on this, but I think there's a lot more room for improvement. And one of the things is just we need to build better infrastructure and better structure for post-publication peer review. So this is something that my student Sarah Schiavone and the rest of our lab are working on, specifically in our field of social and personality psychology, developing a rubric and an app to go with it to help reviewers when they're reading a paper, maybe it's a preprint, maybe it's something published already, to flag the potential threats that they see. So we are working around the 4 validities framework that's popular in psychology and trying to make it easy for reviewers to flag specific threats to validity. And this also makes it easier to do modular reviews, where maybe you're not going to look for all the problems, but you're just like that Just Says in my Twitter account that James Heathers runs, where you're just looking at one aspect of external validity. Are they studying something in the lab and generalizing to the field? Or maybe you're just looking at the validity of the causal inferences. So we want to try to make it easier to do post-publication peer review in a way that's easier to aggregate, easy to do quickly and modularly if you want, easier to crowdsource, and easier for other users to benefit from without having to read a long narrative review. So there's other efforts like this trying to make post-publication peer review easier and more useful. There's also post-publication techniques, forensic techniques that can look at a literature, try to identify whether that set of literature looks robust and credible, or whether it looks like it has bias. One way to do this is to compare the distribution of p-values, for example, in the literature to what we would expect the distribution to look like if those results were all true positives. And this app is a really useful way to play around with that, because I think many of us, including me, intuitions were really off about what the distribution of p-values should look like when there's a real effect. It turns out that p-values very close to 0 should be much, much more common than p-values closer to the alpha or 0.05 or whatever the threshold is. And this is true even at low levels of power. So there's more and more techniques to be able to identify potential biases in the literature, to be able to critique specific things, and we need to encourage that and do more of it. But one of the issues, and one of the reasons I want to go beyond just talking about transparency, but talking about what transparency is for, is that the transparency part of the credibility revolution is the easy part. It's asking people to keep doing new research and making discoveries and be exciting, maybe even flashy, but just be transparent about it. And that's the easier part to swallow. As much as there has been resistance to that, I don't think that's going to be the hardest part. The harder part is going to be getting people to do the critical appraisal and rewarding and valuing the people who do the critical appraisal. And part of that is just human nature. As Kurt Vonnegut said, another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. It's not just that. There are people who want to do the critical appraisal part, but we discourage them and we disincentivize them. We call them names, we question whether they're real scientists, whether they have what it takes to do original research, and so on. So I think we need to stop doing that, recognize that those people are making it possible for the rest of us to go around saying that science is self-correcting and that our science is credible and you should trust it because we have all these mechanisms for self-correction. This is important because I think we all get in the habit of saying science is self-correcting and so on. And we may even point to transparency, but we need to not forget that that last part, that critical appraisal part, using that transparency to try to science better, is really, really important. And so I was struck by this when I came across this quote in Naomi Oreskes' recent book, Why Trust Science. She was talking about how she knows that science is trustworthy. And she, the same way I know other empirical facts, through observation. When I observe scientists, we find that they have developed a variety of practices for vetting knowledge, for identifying problems in their theories and experiments, and attempting to correct them. I was very excited to hear what these practices are. She leaves it at that. And so I think we really need to force ourselves to articulate what are these practices. We say we have these mechanisms, but what are they? And I would challenge us to consider James Heathers' perspective, which he expressed in this tweet when he said, in reality, mechanisms to correct bad science are slow, unreliably enforced, capricious, with only the barest nod towards formal policy, confer no reward, and sometimes punitive elements for a complainant who might use them. So I would argue that transparency is for credibility, but it's not enough. We need critical appraisal too. And meta-science can help us measure these things and assess how much transparency and critical appraisal exists in different fields. And I have a paper version of this talk if you're curious with my collaborator, Alex Holcomb. I'm sorry this went a little bit long. I hope we still have some time for questions. I would love to hear people's thoughts on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Simine, for your great talk. And I really like your emphasis on not only the importance of transparency, but also the critical appraisal, which you hear not that often. I see that from the chat, we have one question. If you're willing to answer the question from the chat, we have a question stating that for many PhD students who work together with commercial companies, and these companies are the industry that is not interested in open science practices, do you have an opinion on how we could apply transparency or appraisal to these cases?
That's a really good question. I mean, there might be no easy short-term solution. It kind of depends how responsive they are to their reputation among scientists more broadly. So if they don't really care how seriously they're taken by the scientific community more broadly, if they care more about the commercial consequences and reputation, then I think the leverage might be quite limited. I think to the extent that the whole scientific community can start linking reputations to these kinds of practices, the more I think we'll have leverage to convince people, even people who have other interests like commercial interests, to want to live up to the standards for what counts as rigorous science. And it's interesting that commercial companies, I mean, I know there's some aspects of open science that they might be less interested in, but there's some aspects that I would expect them to do better at. For example, the red team approach. When there's a lot of money on the line, I would expect a company to want to hire people in-house to try to poke holes in the research before putting a lot of investment in it and rolling it out publicly. So maybe that side of things would be one angle. So at least internally within the company, being more open and transparent and trying to poke holes in things, even if they're not willing to do that completely publicly. Yeah. I know it's not quite the same as open science.
No, but still. Thank you. If there are any other questions from the chat, please post them in the chat, or you could also, for the audience, raise your hand if you would rather voice your question to Simine.
Yeah, and feel free to email me if you think of anything else later. I apologize that I can't stay for the whole thing, but as you mentioned, it is quite late here.
Right, in Australia right now, so no problem at all. We have another question from Toon Kuppens. Are there any guidelines? Sorry, I have to click to the chat.
Yeah.
Are there any guidelines for the procedure to follow when doing the critical appraisal? For example, when, how to contact researchers that might help to decrease the negative attitudes you were talking about towards those who do the critical appraisal?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it probably depends a lot on the nature of the critical appraisal and the stage at which it's happening. If it's happening before the paper is out, that's very different than if the paper's already published. And also the career stage of the people doing it and so on. And I think that contacting the researchers is great in most cases. I think that should be the default, or at least should be considered. There should be a default step where you consider whether or not to do it and make a kind of reflected decision. I think there are sometimes good reasons not to follow that path, though. The other thing is that I think often the other readers would benefit from the critical appraisal, so keeping it private is not necessarily in the best interest of science, but certainly keeping it professional is very much so. Not only will it reduce the negative attitudes on the part of the authors, but also third-party observers benefit a lot more if the debate and the discussion is happening at a professional level and stays out of inappropriate personal attacks or things like that. So always keeping it focused on the research, keeping it focused on keeping it in the professional realm is really important and will increase the value of the criticism.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I would have a small question coming from the OSCG. I was just wondering, purely curious, whether at your new university in Australia, Melbourne, whether they already have an open science community.
That's a great question. I don't think there's an official open science community. Well, so there's an Australia, New Zealand reproducibility open science community, and they have chapters in different cities. So there is a chapter for the Melbourne, but it's not specific to the University of Melbourne. I think it's all of the Melbourne region and the universities there. It hasn't been as active lately, especially because Melbourne is in lockdown. But yeah,
the pandemic. We all have to deal with that. But I guess the Netherlands is a little bit smaller than Australia. So the Groningen area is smaller than Melbourne. We don't have multiple universities within this district. Okay, so if there are no pressing other questions, I suggest we go to the coffee. We just have a final question to you. It's from Maurits Masselink, and he asks, a lot of students and ERCs want to include open science practices, but they have the feeling they run into a wall of so-called the system, which pushes them to closed science direction or being less open. Do you have a suggestion how we could avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, one issue is it depends who the people pushing back are. If it's your advisor, I would suggest, and this is not a very popular suggestion, but I would suggest considering switching advisors, because I think that having an advisor who tries to block good practice is really hard to get around. At least in the American system, your advisor has a lot of influence and control over your practices. So I think getting out and finding a lab where you can be encouraged to do these practices would be worth it. If the people pushing back are more like journal editors or other gatekeepers, I think it can be worth trying to push back on them, pushing back. And I think it's best when those things are done either out in the open, if possible, but that's not always possible, but at least in a way that if it all became public, you would be able to stand by what you said and so on. So professionally and politely and so on. The other thing I would recommend is being active on Twitter and also in open science communities like the one that you're in, so that you can find other people to help you, first of all, just for morale when you hit those resistance, but also find people who maybe have dealt with that situation before and have some ideas about how to push back, or know of other avenues you can go around the people that are pushing back, things like that. So, I would always consider reaching out to people who have been outspoken about these things. I'm happy if people want to ask questions about like how to push back on an editor or that kind of thing. I think there are ways to do that. And I've seen editors when someone pushes back, it does happen sometimes. The editors, I saw one, I helped someone craft an email replying to an editor who had made a mistake, and the editor replied, "I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I did that. Of course you're right." It does happen sometimes. So sometimes it's worth pushing back.
Yeah, great. Okay,
and yeah, I'm happy to share my slides. Yeah, so I will send them. Maybe you can post them somewhere, or maybe I'll post them on OSF and tweet the link or something like that.
Okay. Well, thank you a lot that you were willing to give us some of your time and your very interesting and inspiring talk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
We will go to the coffee break. I'm not sure whether you will hang around during the break for chat or...
I can be here during the break, yeah. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay much past that, but I'm happy to stay during the break. Yeah.
We still have a 3-minute break. We now start the coffee break and we'll be back at 2. Thanks again, Simine.
Great, thank you.
Welcome back. I think we're ready to start again with the program, and welcome to the people that have just joined us. My name is Giulia Trentacosti and I work at the University Library. I'm the open access specialist there, and I'm also one of the organizers of this event. I'd like to introduce our second keynote speaker of the day now, Ineke Wessel. Ineke is an associate professor of experimental psychopathology at the University of Groningen at the Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences. She has been studying emotional autobiographical memory since the 1990s, and her research interests include the involvement of memory in the origins and maintenance of psychopathology, and the malleability of emotional memories themselves, including false and recovered memories. Recently, she became fascinated with the replication crisis in psychology and what this might mean for clinical psychology. Having received, and I'm quoting her here, old school academic training, she tries to switch to open science practices as much as possible in her teaching and also in her research, of course. And I believe she will tell us more about this in her talk now, titled Benefits and Challenges of Adopting Open Research Practices. So welcome, Ineke, and the floor is yours now, so you can start sharing your screen.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for inviting me to this talk. And to be honest, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach compared to the previous speaker. The motto or the call for the Open Research Award said somewhere we are looking for candid accounts. And I thought, well, if the Light Talk speakers should be candid, and I might as well be also. So that's why I'd like to show you one of my Twitter conversations of this summer. I'm doing this Twitter thing, and Michael Free asked, "What song describes your academic career best?" The first thing that came to mind is an old Radiohead song. "What the hell am I doing here? I belong here." And I think that's the red thread throughout my whole career, and I hope to make that clear to you throughout this talk. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, personal history, about how I came where I am, what went wrong, what have I changed in the past years, what have I learned from that, and then also I'd like to talk about broader implications, and all from my perspective, and that's the perspective of a mid-career researcher beyond. I never can decide what I am. I'm not, am I mid-career or am I late career? At any rate, I'm not early career. And that's the term that you hear a lot in the open science group. Okay, so my past, and it's a bit daunting, but I started my undergraduate studies in 1986 in Maastricht at Maastricht University. I was a postdoc there at PhD, was a postdoc. I started out as an assistant professor as well. And at that time, yeah, it was different, and that should be obvious by now. So I was sort of academically raised by people in the group who said, well, if I can't find the effect with N is 15 per condition, then I don't believe in it, and I'm not interested. You might say to you in the coffee room, well, if you're writing up your method section, don't make it too complex, because that's too confusing for the reviewers. You know that you write things, so disclose things. Also, when you got your reviews, then you might say, okay, well, they might ask for kinds of things you might find ridiculous. But as we say in the Netherlands, klant is koning, so reviewer king should have to do what they ask you to do. So that's the sort of environment that I grew in academically, and of course Maastricht was not the only university where that happened. It was all around, and been recently rereading from the 1980s by Daniel Wegner and his colleagues about the suppression effect. And there you see it in the method section and in the results section. You just see it there very plainly. He's talking about how he did some follow-up studies with NS10 per question and how he didn't find it. He doesn't publish the results. So I worked in that environment. I always felt a little bit uncomfortable because I never found those beautiful effects, those effects that you saw in the literature. And I decided that I did something wrong. And yeah, just carried on. I did witness some fraud in the meantime. I went to Toronto in 1992 and worked with someone who was later identified as a fraudster. I was on the Corona, the promotion committee of one of Diederik Stapel's PhD students. And it turned out the chapter that I had asked my question about was indeed fabricated data. I didn't notice. How can you? So I encountered some of those things, but I never really thought that was complete. And I always thought, well, these are exceptions, just like you have steal millions from the bank. They're not to be trusted. The rest of us is well willing. So you might have noticed that my past was until 2016, while in 2011 a lot of things already happened in the field that I was unaware of. So in 2016, I sort of got acquainted with the problems by reading a blog post by Brian Watsing, and that's a very famous, has become a very famous blog post. It was about a grad student who never said no, and she was given a few data sets, and they would go through the data sets, and then she would come back with puzzling new results, and every day they would scratch their heads and ask why, and then come up with another way to reanalyze the data, and yet another set of plausible hypotheses. The reactions to that blog post were, are you kidding? Are you really doing this? This has got to be a prank, right? And he was completely serious. Yeah, this is how we're doing it. And well, cool data deserves spontaneous, cool discoveries. And you have to sort of search a little bit for your results. So I was very interested by this discussion and all these follow-up posts. And I started wondering, so what exactly is wrong with those deep data types Brian Watsing is doing? And I remember one of our research days with our group, we were talking about our research for the coming years, and a colleague asked me at lunch, what is wrong? Why isn't it, what's the problem with doing that? I didn't know the answer. So then I started looking into the literature and I discovered some things, and I expect that you will already know them. And having seen that there are a lot of statisticians in the audience, I'm getting a bit nervous now. But what is wrong, for example, is a problem that's called a garden of the forking paths, and that's described by Gelman and Lopen, and Dorothy Bishop has published a paper on it as well, in which she provided this animation that you're seeing right now. So this example is about a study with ADHD children and typical children, normal, as you would say, in quotes. And there are all characteristics that can differ in those children. They can be their age, they can be older young children, they can be skilled or not skilled, they can have certain hand preference or not. And each of those characteristics you can involve in your analysis. And that leads to a number of decision points, like you see the animation here. And in total, she says there's a number, there's about 16 possible comparisons. And it depends if you take decisions based on your data, which way to go. Yeah, that's only one part of the whole picture. What she says as well, and what the problem is about, is that uncorrected p-values in those instances can be misleading. And what she says as well here, there are 16 possible contrasts. And that makes the probability of at least one positive 65%. 56%, sorry. It's not that bad. It's bad, but it's not that bad. So the point is that it's possible to have multiple comparisons, potential comparisons, and if you make your decisions based on the data, you're sort of fooling yourself. And you're fooling yourself without any conscious intent to commit fraud. So, and this is another example. This is something that I discovered. One of the ways I'm doing this is that when I take up a new topic, I try to teach about it. So this was a topic I looked into for a course in the Honors College a few years back. And I came across a lecture on YouTube by Zoltan Dines, who was explaining also related to the Garden of Forking Paths problem, the use of a multiverse analysis. So his example was about a paper that had been published about the ovulatory cycle, the menstrual cycle in women, and politics, the political choices. And what he argued was that if you look at the data or the features of the method, there were about 120 actual combinations of defining variables. For example, if you look at menses, menstrual onset can vary. Is the period day 8 until day 14 when people are fertile, or is it you take day 9 or day 10 even as a starting point? So there's all kinds of flexibility in how you define your choices. And he showed this graph of a plot of all these 120 outcomes, and it looked like this. And note that the one that was published in the paper was not significant. It was one of the few that was significant. There were a lot that were not statistically significant, and also you see the effect went in all directions, so from negative to positive. So this was the whole array of possible outcomes. It sort of struck me. I sort of believe that this was the variability, and that it really depended on your choices were published, and how coincidental it was that this point was application. So this is another example. Yeah, the way you can get all those different outcomes. I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the term p-hacking. I'm sure everybody knows about ways of hacking their p. So I'll just leave it at this. So these are a number of methodological statistical decisions they take to influence your eventual outcome. So what happens to us as researchers, as individual researchers, is that we're in a tunnel. in a confirmation bias. And in the previous talk, it was also clear that about 90% of the results for the publications in psychology are positive. And it's not because everybody is willfully committing fraud. It's because you have a theory, you believe in that theory. If you look at your data, then of course it's so evident you should have controlled for this and that variable. How could you not have that prior to starting your analysis, and so on and so on. So you're very much inclined, it's very human to have a confirmation bias, to confirm your results, or want to confirm your theory. So that's being in a tunnel when you're analyzing, but also you're sort of in a tunnel when it comes to publishing. Because if you have null results, you know that it's not so easy to get them published. So it takes a lot of effort to submit them, and then you get all those rejections, and it's very easy to just leave them where they are in your drawer and move on to the results that are positive. Because it has consequences. If you publish positive results, if you have publications, then it means promotion. It may mean grant money. It can mean public fame. Maybe you're asked for shows. If you're in a discipline that is eligible for Nobel Prizes, you might get big awards. And this, of course, rewards and reinforces your tunnel. Your career depends on publishing positive results. And it's not only the individual researcher. Maurits already talked in the chat before about the system. The system also consists of journals, editors, journals who want prestige. They want a big impact factor, high impact factor, and they also want to have money. They want to payments. And also institutions. So this is our lovely academy building in Groningen. And also the university wants money because then they can do more. The university wants prestige. They want to be the first on several indices and lists of best universities. So it's a whole system that is geared towards keeping the bias alive. So what is wrong with deep data dives? Well, may increase false positive findings. It is not to say that you never can explore. Of course, it can be very useful to generate hypotheses. But if you then go on and say, okay, I hypothesized this from the start, and that's a thing. And your deep data dives and your false positive publications may contribute to or maintain biased literature. So what did I change? Well, there's a lot that you can change if you're in the field for so long as I am, and it's sort of daunting where to start. One of the things I've changed was focusing on my file drawer. So in the course of decades, I had collected a number of data files that were still there. And I did this together with Casper Albers, Anne Roos Sands. I was the actual master thesis student of one of the studies time, Vera Heininga, just introduced at the beginning of the session. We were triggered by a call by the journal Memory, who issued a call for a special issue on null results. And I called it Towards a Complete Understanding of Memory, Theoretically Important Failures to Null Hypotheses. And of course, Memory is not the only journal that calls for null results. There are more. I think this was a very important trigger for us. That made me think, well, if I want to publish my null results, then I should perhaps grasp this opportunity. Back to the 90s, I feel I need to give a little bit background of where these experiments were, where they came from. I'll try to keep it short. So as I began my PhD in 1993, the whole community was shook up, or the clinical psychology community at any rate, by the recovered memories. Elizabeth Loftus published about that in 1993 about how patients in therapy with all memories of horrible abuse that they hadn't known for years or decades, and sort of they had to work through in therapy to be rid of the pains. So this was America. In the Netherlands. My promoter Harold Merkelbach and myself wrote about it. Harold Merkelbach, Hans Krombach also published a book about it. It was a very heated discussion. And there were two sides in the debate. So the one side said, well, memories of severe childhood trauma is stressed, needs to be recovered in order to heal. And the experimental psychologists more or less said, well, repression doesn't exist. Recovered memories are false memories. And we, Harold and I, were part of the experimental camp. But it sort of intrigued me because all this debate triggered a lot of new paradigms into both false memory, but also in memory inhibition. People tried in the laboratory to find an analog for repression, Freudian repression. And that intrigued me. So there were several of those memory inhibition paradigms. I tried them all, never found something. And then in 2001 in Nature was a publication by the new paradigm by Anderson and Green, who said, well, we now have an analog of repression. And Martin Conway, in a commentary in the same issue of Nature, also said so in common terms. So, and of course, I jumped to the opportunity, especially because I contacted Michael Anderson, and he said, just before the publication came out, he said, well, now I have something, just sit, I'll send it to you. So he was very open about it. I got all his materials. I set out to replicate his paradigm. Very briefly, what is it about? What you have to do as a participant, you have to study wares, weakly related, for example, gossip, cockroach, where cockroach is the target. Then there's a phase in which you have to suppress. So you get the keyword gossip, and you have to suppress the target word, cockroach. There are also response trials. I didn't write them out here, but you have to suppress certain words, and you have to respond to certain ones. And then afterwards you get a recall task, and the whole idea is to count all the words that you learned previously. So there are two types of tests. There's a same probe recall test and an independent recall test. In the same probe, you get the same word as in the study phase, gossip. You have to respond to cockroach. And in the independent probe, you get a word that is related to the keyword. It's not the same. So here in this instance, it's a semantic category. So a cockroach is an insect. It's related to the target sort. So, and the idea was, if you really truly have been inhibited memory, if you've repressed that memory, then also when it's cued with something completely different, you should be able to recall it. And in that Nature publication, this is what they found over 3 experiments, and response trials got better over time, and suppressed trials got worse in recall. That was the case for the same probe and also for the independent probe. And that, especially the independent, was very important for inhibition theory. So here we had a paradigm that promised to measure what we were looking for all the time. So I set out to replicate. I first did it. Original replication didn't work. Then another one didn't work. Then we adapted something and we looked at personality traits. That worked a little bit and that was published. Then again in Groningen in the meantime, did another paradigm, another go at the original paradigm. That also worked, so that was also published. And then there was another version that we tried, and that didn't work. We put it in the file drawer. Sometimes you found a same probe effect in these experiments, but you never found an independent probe effect. And that's the most thing. So what we did next with Vera, Anne Roos, and Casper is construct several data sets of that, and we conduct a multiverse analysis, just like I showed in the Zoltandines example. Well, just very briefly, this is what happens. These beautiful pictures on Vazire. So this was sample 1, and triangles are same probes, and the circles are independent probes. Here you see that there's one lucky one, but the rest is all above the magical border or threshold 0.05. Then in sample 2, there was a lot more going on for triangles, the same probe, not so much for the independent probes. Experiment 3, or sample 3, and this was published sample. Here you see also that triangles have a bit of trouble going under the P of 0.05. And there are people calling this the Goldilocks zone when it comes to P values, because they're relatively high still. These are all same probes for the independent probes. Much going on. And for sample 4, which was also published, you see that the same probe effect was pretty strong over all those tests. And again, the independent probe can do a lot of things. Can't seem to find my mouse. Oh, here it is. Okay, so what we concluded from this is that there was not much evidence that inhibition is a viable model for repression. So this was published this summer, and I was very happy to have published null results. What have I learned from this? Oh, I promised in my title I would talk about benefits and challenges to opening up. So benefits, we pre-registered the analysis plan, and that was useful because doing the analysis we could go back to our past selves and look up what it was that we had thought about prior to doing this. We had a team with people with complementary skills. So Vera is very good in R and R Markdown. I'd never seen R Markdown. Knitting PDFs, I failed terribly. And she did a marvelous job. So I had also used new tools that I'd never used before in publications. And also I learned not to tolerate that I was completely in control. And that was a hard thing to do. It's not particular to open science, of course. I mean, whenever you work with teams, that's a problem. That's a feature. It's also a good thing. We opened up our hood, so everything was on the OSF, and therefore it should be available for the world, the community, to critically praise. And that's also a bit scary, of course. And we did this multiverse approach. It was also relieving not to talk in terms of this one unique analysis that was under this P.05 level or not. It was a relief to talk about patterns of p-values and results. I also learned some modesty because study 3 or sample 3 was published, and it was one of the different results that was published. And we also wrote up the discussion. It's probably not robust. Challenges. So these are the 4 things that I just listed. The challenge to each of them is time. It cost a lot of time. We invested a lot of hours in this project, and we had to go back and forth between the analysis and R and whatever. Luckily, the review process wasn't that elaborate. It was, it cost much more time than your regular article. And that's what most people say when they say, well, I'm not really getting the time to do things. And people say, well, what you put in up front when you pre-register, you will pay back by the end. My experience, that's only partly true. It takes up a lot of time. That's also the multiverse approach, of course. So broader implications. So this is not to boast, but what I did was in the years that since I discovered Brian Wansing's blog post, is that I've tried to apply open science in my different roles that I have. So when I do research, I pre-register, I put my materials on the open science framework, also my data, to the extent that GDPR lets me. As a reviewer, I ask for open materials and data. And as a lecturer, I teach open science in thesis projects, of course. But also, I'm involved in the postdoctoral training for clinical psychologists. And those people have to do a research project, try to teach open science to them as well. And in the back of my head, I sort of hope that I'm changing the whole field of clinical psychology, which is, of course, much more work. And as a colleague or a member of our faculty, I co-organize our reproducibility meetings that we sort of kicked off, I think, in January somewhere. Okay, so with all those things, am I feeling that I belong now? Well, to be very honest, not entirely. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of the talk. I think, and that's only my experience, I think that there's a young-old people gap. And I have some colleagues who start snickering whenever I talk about old people. And yeah, well, it's what I call MCR, mid-career researchers or beyond, the senior ones. This is a picture that I stole from Twitter. Someone posted on Twitter the poll, the opening poll during SIPS conference of the Society for Improvement in Psychological Science in 2019 in Rotterdam. And it's not very clear, but you can see here, when it comes to the current academic status, most of the people who were there, 83, were graduate students, and there were 36 postdocs, there were 33 early career people, mid-career 25, and late 2. And I didn't show the age distribution, but there were about 5 people over 50, and I was one of them. So it's a young crowd, and also at the conference, I experienced it as welcoming and open, but also I experienced a sort of a sense of in-group, and that can be very much a personal take on things, but it's also something I experience when it comes to those reproducibilities that we have every 2 weeks. Excuse me. There seem to be, we open them up to everybody, so also to the senior people, but most of the time my impression is that there's people at the postdoc graduate student level who join. There are people who are more senior, no doubt, but they are the minority. And I know of other tea meetings that are exclusively for ECR, for young people. Excuse me. I think it's very important to involve more old people in open science. And this is the slide about the systemic level that I showed earlier. Remember that I did this multiverse analysis was because a journal called for them. So it's very important that institutions like journals, like universities, like grant funders, pull out or get incentives to promote these initiatives. And older people are in the positions to advise, to hire personnel, to evaluate their personnel, to evaluate programs, whole science programs, to change incentives, and to make policies. It's very, very important that those plus people also join in this movement. And what kind of challenges do you hear? I'm talking personal experiences and not from a systematic approach, but you hear a lot of time constraints hamper learning all the new stuff. So, and then I think the solution would be to gather in teams like we did for the multiverse paper. And I think that the whole system should turn to incentivizing teamwork more instead of individual researchers' curriculum vitae. Other challenges. So there's a challenge you hear. I will say that their fear to be scooped. So when you're first with a exciting new COVID medicine, for example, or vaccine. But I think the solution is in pre-registration itself. Pre-registration is time. But I also think a policy change would help if pre-registrations would be rewarded, preprints would be rewarded instead of the more incentivizing publications and grants. And there's another challenge that is more ingrained in our research culture, I think, and I think Simine also talked a little bit about that. It's not cool to show that you're human, that you make errors, that weaknesses. You're in a competitive environment, and it's just not rewarded. Then also there's this in-group, out-group feeling that I got a little at the SIPS conference. And I talked to some younger people before, and they sort of recognize that, hey, how can we play a role in getting older people or more senior people more into our movement? So yeah, sort of you're looking at a culture change, but how do you do that? And that's I think that's something that we really need to think about in the future with each other, and that we need to build bridges between, if there's a gap between the more senior and the more early career people, we need to bridge that gap. And this is the end of my talk. This is the bridge in Maastricht where I began, and it's time for questions or discussion if there is any time left. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ineke, for the great presentation and for taking us through this journey your individual journey with open science. Are there any questions? Yes, I can see that there are some questions in the chat. The first one, do you know whether any courses exist that teach multiverse analysis?
No, I don't know of any, and I think that maybe the statisticians in the crowd can answer that better than I can.
Yeah, maybe they can do that in the chat.
Yeah, maybe but it's essentially, it's thinking about every possible analysis that you might want to do and then just do them. And of course, we didn't do everything that there was to do. There's always more. Ha.
Yeah, we have an answer, a long answer. Should I read the other question that we have from Peter van der Roven? The other day I read a dissertation in the epidemiology of COPD that designated itself as, oh sorry, the chat keeps scrolling, hypothesis-free association study. Do you think this type of analysis, which appears to be quite common in epidemiology, violates the principles you are advocating?
I don't know, because I don't know what they really mean with the hypothesis-free association study. If it is that you look at your data and follow certain paths, then I would say if you restrict yourself too much, then you might be looking at the problem, yeah, that you're focusing on false positives. So what I would do in that case is to associate along all the paths that are possible and report everything.
So we have a few more answers to the first question in the chat, and Vera also says that she's happy for you to email her separately if you want to know more.
And I see that the Nothing But the Truth conference will have a symposium about it. So
okay, yes.
There you go.
Thank you, Vera, for the information. Are there any more questions? Okay, the discussion is going on about hypothesis-free studies in the chat. We have another answer.
Yeah, clearly report what you did. Yeah, nothing wrong with exploration. And yeah, of course, and that's not what I try to defend, that you shouldn't explore, not at all. You shouldn't, I think the warning was against that you, when you explore, that you say that it wasn't exploration, it was hypothesis testing.
So if there are no other pressing questions, we can go on a break now, and we'll be back soon with with the lightning talks. And thank you so much, Ineke, for the presentation.
Thank you.